The return of the rejected self is not a dramatic invasion, but a slow and deliberate movement within the psyche, shaped by time and neglect. What we reject in ourselves is rarely trivial. It is often bound to fear, shame, or an identity we were not ready to accept. In the early stages of life, rejection can feel necessary for survival. We learn what is welcomed and what is not, and we organize our inner world accordingly. Yet the psyche does not dispose of what is pushed away. It preserves it. The rejected self becomes silent, not absent. It observes from beneath awareness, storing experiences, emotions, and unrealized potentials. Over time, this hidden aspect gains strength, not through aggression, but through accumulation. It waits until consciousness is capable of bearing it. When it returns, it does not do so to disrupt life, but to restore balance. The individual often experiences this return as an inner tension, a sense that something essential has been overlooked. This is the psyche signaling that growth can no longer proceed without reconciliation. Confrontation with this rejected part is inevitable because psychological wholeness cannot be built on exclusion. What is denied within us continues to shape our behavior from the shadows, influencing choices, reactions, and relationships without our awareness. The moment of return is therefore not an act of rebellion, but an invitation to responsibility. The self that comes back seeks recognition, not dominance. It asks to be integrated into conscious life so that its energy may serve rather than sabotage. This process requires courage, but not force. Fear dissolves when understanding replaces judgment. As we face what was once rejected, we often discover that it contains qualities we need: strength, sensitivity, creativity, or truth. The encounter reshapes our sense of identity, expanding it beyond the narrow boundaries we once defended. In accepting the rejected self, we do not lose who we are, we become more fully ourselves. This integration marks a quiet but decisive step toward inner coherence, where opposing parts no longer compete for control, but participate in a shared psychological order. Fear often stands at the entrance of inner life like a vigilant guardian, convincing us that it exists to protect us from harm. In truth, fear is not an enemy, nor is it a weakness. It is a signal that meaning has not yet been understood. When an experience, emotion, or inner impulse lacks interpretation, fear fills the gap, creating distance between consciousness and what it does not yet comprehend. In this way, fear performs a necessary function, preventing premature confrontation with material that could overwhelm the mind. Yet problems arise when fear is mistaken for truth rather than a placeholder. We begin to organize our lives around avoidance, mistaking safety for growth. The psyche tolerates this only for a time. As life unfolds, situations repeat themselves, discomfort returns in familiar forms, and fear grows louder, not because danger has increased, but because meaning has been ignored. Fear guards the unknown only until understanding is possible. Once meaning becomes accessible, fear has no task left to perform. The dissolution of fear does not occur through force or denial, but through attentive engagement with what it conceals. When we turn toward the source of fear with curiosity rather than resistance, we begin to translate the unknown into experience that can be understood. Meaning transforms chaos into structure. What once appeared threatening reveals its purpose, and fear quietly withdraws. This process is often subtle and gradual. The individual may notice that situations which once provoked anxiety no longer carry the same weight, not because they have disappeared, but because they have been integrated into conscious awareness. Fear fades when it is no longer needed as a warning. It gives way to responsibility, insight, and a grounded sense of direction. Facing meaning does not eliminate difficulty, but it replaces blind reaction with informed choice. In this way, fear completes its role as guardian and steps aside, allowing the individual to move forward with clarity rather than avoidance. Fear emerges whenever the mind stands before something it cannot yet place within its existing structure of meaning. It is not born from weakness, but from uncertainty, and it appears most strongly when consciousness senses that something important lies just beyond its grasp. In this sense, fear acts as a temporary guardian, marking the boundary between what is known and what has not yet been understood. Early in life, this guardian serves a useful role, encouraging caution while the personality is still forming. However, as inner life grows more complex, fear can remain long after its original purpose has passed. It begins to protect not the individual, but the familiar identity they have constructed. What challenges this identity is labeled dangerous, even when it carries growth. Over time, fear becomes a habit rather than a signal. It no longer points to real threat, but to areas of life where meaning has been postponed. The psyche responds by creating repeated inner discomfort, urging the individual to look more closely. Fear persists not because the unknown is hostile, but because it has not yet been given language, context, or place within consciousness. When meaning is approached directly, fear begins to loosen its grip without resistance or struggle. This does not happen through bravado or suppression, but through patient attention. By allowing the feared experience to be examined rather than avoided, the mind slowly translates it into something comprehensible. Meaning gives shape to what was once vague and structure to what felt chaotic. As understanding grows, fear no longer has a function to perform. It withdraws naturally, much like a watchful presence stepping aside once its task is complete. This does not imply that life becomes effortless or free of challenge. Rather, challenges are met with clarity instead of reflexive anxiety. The individual gains the capacity to respond rather than react. Fear dissolves because it has been fulfilled, not defeated. What remains is a deeper sense of orientation, where action is guided by insight instead of avoidance. In this state, the psyche moves forward with steadiness, no longer guarded by fear, but supported by understanding. The unconscious does not communicate through direct statements or clear intentions, because it exists beyond the orderly logic of waking thought. Instead, it speaks in images, repetitions, and subtle pressures that shape inner experience over time. Dreams, sudden emotional reactions, recurring thoughts, and unexplained attractions or resistances are not random events, but symbolic expressions seeking acknowledgement. When consciousness ignores these signals, the unconscious does not retreat. It adapts. It finds new ways to make itself known, often by intensifying its messages. What is unrecognized seeks form, and what lacks form seeks expression. This is not an act of disruption, but of balance. The unconscious carries material that consciousness has not yet made room for, whether memories, insights, or unrealized capacities. Its language is indirect because it must bypass the defenses that keep awareness narrow and predictable. In this way, the psyche preserves its wholeness, ensuring that no essential element is permanently excluded from the inner life. Recognition transforms the relationship between consciousness and the unconscious from conflict into dialogue. When symbolic material is met with attention rather than dismissal, its urgency diminishes. A dream reflected upon, a recurring emotion examined, or a persistent inner image explored begins to reveal its meaning. What once felt intrusive becomes informative. The unconscious does not demand obedience. It seeks understanding. As its symbols are interpreted, they lose their compulsion and gain clarity. This process allows unconscious energy to be integrated into conscious life, where it can support decision-making and personal direction rather than undermine it. The individual becomes less driven by unseen forces and more guided by insight. Recognition does not mean indulgence, nor does it mean surrendering control. It means allowing what was hidden to take its place within awareness. Through this engagement, the psyche moves toward coherence, and the inner world becomes less divided, more intelligible, and more aligned with the individual's conscious aims. What is avoided does not lose its influence, it gains it. When an experience, emotion, or truth is pushed aside, it does not dissolve into nothingness. Instead, it moves beyond the reach of conscious reflection, where it operates without correction or context. Avoidance creates a vacuum, and the psyche fills that space with projection, assumption, and repetition. The more firmly something is resisted, the more energy is required to keep it out of awareness. This energy does not disappear. It manifests as tension, irritability, or patterns of behavior that seem disconnected from their cause. Over time, what is avoided begins to shape life indirectly. Decisions are made around it, reactions are intensified by it, and relationships are colored by its presence. The individual may feel controlled by circumstances, unaware that the source of this control lies within. Avoidance does not preserve stability, it distorts it. What is denied becomes powerful precisely because it remains undefined and unexamined. Facing what has been avoided does not grant immediate comfort, but it grants form. When attention is turned toward the neglected inner material, it begins to take shape within consciousness. Fear gives way to clarity as the unknown becomes known. What once felt overwhelming reveals limits, meaning, and proportion. By giving form to what was previously avoided, the psyche regains balance. Energy once spent on resistance becomes available for purposeful action. This act of facing does not require dramatic confrontation. It requires honesty and patience. Even small acts of recognition weaken the grip of the avoided content. As it becomes integrated, it no longer needs to express itself through disruption. The individual gains a sense of agency, not because difficulties vanish, but because they are no longer ruled by unseen forces. In giving form to what was avoided, one transforms inner chaos into structure, allowing life to be guided by understanding rather than fear. The integration of the shadow is not an act of moral compromise, but a psychological necessity. The shadow contains those qualities, impulses, and tendencies that consciousness has judged unacceptable or inconvenient. These elements are often incompatible with the image one wishes to uphold, and so they are excluded in order to preserve a coherent identity. Yet this coherence is fragile, built on omission rather than truth. The shadow does not consist only of what is destructive or flawed. It also holds vitality, instinct, and capacities that were never permitted expression. When left unintegrated, the shadow expresses itself indirectly, often through projection onto others or through sudden, uncharacteristic behavior. The individual reacts strongly to traits in the external world that mirror what has been denied within. This creates inner division, where parts of the psyche work against one another. Integration begins when the individual recognizes that wholeness does not mean purity, but completeness. To acknowledge the shadow is to accept that the human psyche is complex, layered, and not governed by a single ideal. Movement toward wholeness occurs when the shadow is brought into conscious relationship rather than kept in exile. This does not require acting out every impulse, nor does it mean abandoning values. It requires awareness. When shadow elements are observed and understood, they lose their compulsive force. The individual gains the ability to choose rather than react. Energy that was bound in inner conflict becomes available for creativity, resilience, and depth of character. Integration strengthens ethical responsibility because it replaces unconscious enactment with conscious discernment. The person becomes less fragmented, less prone to inner contradiction, and more capable of holding tension without collapse. Wholeness is not the absence of darkness, but the capacity to contain it without being overtaken. In this state, the psyche functions as a unified system rather than a divided one. The individual no longer strives to appear complete, but begins to live from a place of genuine psychological balance, where opposing forces are acknowledged and held in meaningful relation. The illusion of control arises from the mind's desire for certainty in a world shaped by inner and outer forces it cannot fully command. Consciousness prefers predictability, structure, and clear causation, and so it constructs narratives of mastery over life and self. These narratives offer comfort, but they often rest on denial. Inner impulses, emotional currents, and unconscious motivations continue to operate regardless of conscious intention. When control is overemphasized, the individual begins to relate to inner life as something to be managed rather than understood. This creates rigidity. Feelings are suppressed if they interfere with plans, intuitions are dismissed if they lack rational explanation, and contradictions are treated as errors rather than signals. Over time, the effort to maintain control becomes exhausting. Life resists simplification, and the psyche responds with tension, anxiety, or a sense of inner disconnection. What is labeled as loss of control is often the psyche's attempt to correct an overly narrow self-concept. The illusion persists because it promises safety, but it cannot provide meaning. Meaning emerges only when inner truth is allowed to speak, even when it disrupts familiar structures. Surrender to inner truth is not passivity, nor is it resignation. It is an active willingness to listen to what arises within, without immediately reshaping it to fit expectation. This form of surrender does not weaken the individual, it deepens them. When control is loosened, the psyche reveals information that was previously inaccessible. Contradictory emotions, ambivalent desires, and uncomfortable insights come into awareness, not to overwhelm, but to inform. Inner truth carries direction, even when it challenges conscious plans. By acknowledging it, the individual enters into cooperation with their own depth. Decisions become less forced and more aligned. Action arises from understanding rather than compulsion. This surrender restores a sense of inner authority that control alone cannot provide. The individual no longer relies on rigid self-command, but on dialogue with the whole psyche. In this relationship, life is not dominated, but navigated with attentiveness and respect. What is gained is not certainty, but coherence, and within that coherence, a more resilient and authentic form of agency takes shape. Psychological maturity does not arise from the accumulation of knowledge alone, but from the capacity to enter into relationship with what is unknown within oneself. The early stages of development are marked by certainty and identification. One learns who to be by adopting roles, beliefs, and values that provide structure and belonging. These frameworks are necessary, yet incomplete. As life progresses, contradictions emerge. Experiences arise that cannot be easily explained or resolved through existing assumptions. At this point, maturity depends on whether the individual defends old certainties or becomes willing to question them. The unknown within begins to announce itself through doubt, confusion, or a quiet sense that something essential is missing. These signals are often resisted as they threaten the coherence of the familiar self-image. However, psychological growth requires the courage to remain in dialogue with uncertainty rather than silencing it. The unknown is not a void, but a source of latent insight. Engaging with it marks the transition from borrowed understanding to lived wisdom. Dialogue with the unknown transforms inner opposition into inner guidance. When unconscious material is allowed expression through reflection, imagination, or attentive listening, it no longer operates as a disruptive force. Instead, it becomes a partner in orientation. This dialogue does not produce immediate answers, but it cultivates discernment. The individual learns to hold tension between opposing perspectives without rushing toward resolution. Over time, this capacity stabilizes the psyche. Choices are no longer driven solely by fear of error or desire for approval, but informed by a broader awareness of inner reality. Psychological maturity expresses itself as patience, humility, and a tolerance for complexity. The individual recognizes that growth does not mean eliminating uncertainty, but learning to live responsibly within it. The unknown remains, but it is no longer hostile. It becomes a guide that expands consciousness beyond its former limits, allowing the personality to evolve in depth, flexibility, and integrity. There comes a moment in inner life when conflict no longer announces itself as disturbance, but as a quiet pressure toward change. For a long time, inner opposition appears as resistance, hesitation against action, doubt against belief, emotion against reason. These tensions are often experienced as obstacles to be eliminated, and much effort is spent choosing one side while suppressing the other. Yet this struggle exhausts the psyche because it misunderstands the nature of opposition. Inner conflict is not a flaw in psychological functioning, but evidence that development is underway. Each opposing force carries partial truth, and neither can be sacrificed without cost. When consciousness matures enough to endure this tension without immediate resolution, something shifts. The conflict begins to reorganize itself. What once demanded dominance now seeks relationship. The psyche stops asking which side should win and begins asking what is being asked to emerge. This marks a decisive inner transition, where struggle gives way to attentiveness and resistance transforms into inquiry. As this shift deepens, inner opposition gradually transforms into inner guidance. The same voices that once contradicted one another now function as correctives, offering balance rather than disruption. Doubt tempers certainty, instinct informs reason, and restraint refines desire. Instead of paralyzing action, these forces shape it. The individual learns to listen inwardly without being ruled by impulse or immobilized by fear. Guidance does not arrive as a command, but as a sense of alignment that develops through reflection and experience. Choices feel less forced, not because they are easy, but because they are coherent. This guidance emerges only when opposition is honored rather than erased. By holding tension consciously, the psyche generates a third position that was not previously available. Action taken from this place carries depth and responsibility. What was once an inner battle becomes an inner compass, orienting the individual toward a life shaped not by avoidance or compulsion, but by integration and quiet clarity. The moment when inner opposition transforms into guidance is not sudden, but a gradual emergence that reflects the psyche's natural intelligence. Throughout life, we encounter internal conflicts that feel irreconcilable. Desires that oppose responsibilities, values that contradict impulses, or emotions that seem to clash with reason. For much of life, these tensions provoke frustration, anxiety, or avoidance. The ordinary response is to suppress one side, to push away what feels uncomfortable, or to impose rigid control in order to maintain a sense of stability. Yet this strategy never resolves the deeper issue. The opposing elements do not disappear. They remain active beneath awareness, influencing thought, behavior, and perception in ways that may feel mysterious or even uncontrollable. Psychological development requires a different approach: patience, observation, and willingness to allow contradiction to exist without immediate judgment. By observing internal opposition without reacting impulsively, the individual begins to recognize that each element carries valuable information about the self. This awareness marks the first step in transforming inner tension into a source of guidance rather than a source of disruption. When the psyche is acknowledged in its entirety, opposing forces begin to interact rather than clash. The qualities that once seemed incompatible, caution and courage, reason and intuition, restraint and spontaneity, begin to balance one another, each providing context for the other. Through conscious attention, what was once experienced as conflict becomes a dialogue within the self. This dialogue is subtle and requires patience. The individual learns to perceive patterns, to notice how certain impulses respond to specific situations, and to integrate insights that arise from reflection. In this process, inner guidance emerges naturally. It is not a rigid directive, but a nuanced orientation toward what is appropriate, meaningful, and responsible. The individual gains the ability to act with clarity and integrity rather than being driven by unconscious pressures or fragmented impulses. Inner opposition no longer dictates behavior through hidden force. It informs it through conscious synthesis. In this way, the psyche evolves from being a site of internal struggle into a source of wisdom, where awareness transforms tension into direction and conflict into coherent action. This transformation demonstrates that the inner world is intelligent and self-correcting when given attention. The previously conflicting elements of the self become allies rather than adversaries. By cultivating presence and reflective engagement, the individual accesses a deeper layer of guidance that is both practical and profound. The lessons drawn from this process are not theoretical, but lived. Choices carry weight, actions align with authentic values, and life is navigated with a sense of coherence previously unavailable. What was once experienced as disruptive opposition becomes an enduring compass, a tool for navigating complexity with patience, discernment, and inner clarity. Through this engagement, the psyche reveals its capacity to turn tension into wisdom, making inner life both richer and more integrated.